So we're continuing our series, as we just said, as Steve has read. We're continuing our series through 1 Samuel, and today we're kind of looking at the next block, chapters 3 to 6, but particularly the verses that we've read out. In last week's sermon, if you were here last week, you may remember. If you weren't here, I spoke on chapter 1, and with the idea of there's a theme I want to look at as we go through the next few sermons. And the theme is, if you take God seriously, He will take you seriously. And we're thinking about what it looks like to take God seriously, what that means. And Hannah, last week, I was suggesting was an example of someone who took God seriously, who made a decision in her prayer life to put God's work sort of at the forefront rather than necessarily her needs. And the result is, as we heard, that God remembered her, God heard her prayer. She had a baby boy, and the child was Samuel, who this book is named for. Now, I've discovered as I've been going through this book and preparing the sermons that Samuel, although this is 1 Samuel, there's a 2 Samuel too. Samuel's not actually around for much of the book. He's kind of, you could argue, he's almost a peripheral character, but it's his book. And this passage, this section, chapters 3 to 6, where Samuel kind of comes into play. But again, he's not really mentioned a huge amount in those chapters. As we've heard about, there's a lot going on. And Samuel's kind of like still almost a footnote in some way. And what this passage talks about is there's tension, there's war between Israel and the Philistines. This is taking place, we're told, at a time when the word of the Lord is rare. Now, Samuel has already become established as someone who hears God and speaks God, as he heard at the beginning of the verse. Samuel's word went out to all Israel. But this is a time where the word of the Lord is rare, and there are a few prophets. There are a few moments where it's seen that God is clearly speaking to his people through someone. And there's war between Israel and the Philistines, and Israel are losing the war. The war's not going well for them, so they decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant that travelled with them through the wilderness, has sort of symbols in it of their time in the wilderness, including the statue on which the Ten Commandments are written and so on. They bring this Ark of the Covenant into their camp. For the Ark symbolises for them God's presence. This is where God is. Now, the word of the Lord is rare, so what can we do to get God on side? We'll bring the Ark. This is God's presence with us. So this way, God goes into battle with us. So they bring the Ark into the camp, but then the unthinkable happens. The Philistines win. Not only do they win, they capture the Ark. And this is devastating. And we hear the message of this defeat is taken back to Eli, who is the priest at the temple. We heard about him last week. And we're told Eli hears his sons, Phinehas and Hophni, who are mentioned, are killed in the battle. And, which is devastating enough, but then he hears that the Ark of the Lord has been captured. And he falls off the seat where he's sitting and he dies when he hears that the Ark of the Lord is captured. Sort of losing his sons is bad enough, but losing God's presence. Israel has lost God's presence. This is too much for Eli the priest, who dies when he hears this. And then the Philistines take the Ark and they place it in their temple to their god Dagon in Ashdod. And as we hear, this isn't good for the Philistines. In fact, what we read about today, the statue of Dagon falling over twice, breaking the second time, it actually gets worse. The Philistines have the Ark, and then disease breaks out amongst the Philistines. And things are going terribly wrong. And they take the Ark from Ashdod and they start to pass it around their villages. Here, why didn't you have the Ark? Why didn't you display? But the villagers know what's going on. They hear what's happening, and they're sort of saying, no, we don't want the Ark. You take it somewhere else. And no one wants the Ark. And eventually the Philistines say, well, we've got to return it to Israel. Well, we can't return it empty-handed. So they return it to Israel with some tributes. And they return it to a place called Beth Shemesh. And the Philistines return the Ark to the people there. And The people at Beth Shemesh have never seen the film Raiders of the Lost Ark. And they are curious about the Ark, and they kind of treat it as an object of curiosity. And we hear that they look inside the Ark and 70 of them die from sort of their sort of disrespectful handling of the Ark of the Covenant. And so this is what happens in the passages we're reading. And the Philistines have learned something, and the people of Beth Shemesh have learned the same lesson, which is that sometimes when God shows up, it's not always a happy event. It's not always a cheerful thing when God shows up. Sometimes God shows up and it can be a very painful thing for us. It can be a difficult, challenging, stressful time when God shows up. That may not be what we expect, but that's how it is sometimes. And the Philistines learn that lesson. The people of Beth Shemesh learn that lesson. Sometimes we say, you know, what I want more than anything is I want God in my life. You know, I just want God. But what if God turns up and he kind of rolls up his sleeves and says, well, I've got a few questions. What if God shows up in our life and he says, well, actually, you're quite comfortable and I want to disturb that? What if God shows up in our lives and says, you know what? Things have got to change. Something has to change. Do you still want God there? Do you still want God to show up there? If that's the agenda with which he's coming. Maybe, like Israel, it's easier for us if God is literally in a box, as he was for them in the Ark of the Covenant. We bring God into our camp and we win the battle. That's how it works. You know, that's the maths. God is our pet. He obeys what we want. You know, we will use him when we need him. But the truth is, you can't bring God into your life and demand that he follows your orders. It doesn't work like that. If you open up your life to God, you forfeit the rights to give orders. You can't, like Israel, say, right, God, I'm bringing you into my life and we're going to win the battle now. That's how it's going to go. That's how it works, right? You can't say that to God. You can't do what the Philistines did, which is take God, put him next to an idol or two and say, right, God, you go there, behave yourself for me, will you? He won't do it. You can't do that. The Philistines said, they realised this too late. They said, we changed our minds, let's get rid of God now. We don't want him anymore. You take him. No, I don't want him. We don't want him. The best we can hope for in that kind of situation is to show God the door and hope he doesn't make too much of a mess on the way out. That's kind of the way the Philistines approached it. Jesus said to people, he said, a passage that some of you will know, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. But I very much agree with something that Richard Rohr observed when he said, before the truth sets you free, it tends to make you miserable. I think this is absolutely spot on. I've shared before many years ago, I'm hoping some of you won't remember, but if you do, it's fine. A story about a time where I had some stuff I wanted to get rid of. I was selling it on eBay, and I had some things I wanted to buy, and I thought I'll sell some stuff on eBay, and maybe with this money I can buy one of the things that I want. And actually the things were selling on auction, they were selling really well. I was going to make lots of more money than I thought. And I thought, well, great, I can not just get one thing I want, I can get 2 or 3 of the things I had on my list that I wanted to get. But I was praying one morning, and while I was praying, I felt God say to me, hey James, that money from the eBay auction, I think you should give that away. I think you should give that away. Now do you think that I was celebrating that morning? You know, God's spoken to me in my quiet time, isn't it wonderful? Do you think, oh, the truth has set me free, I'm so happy? I was not happy. I did not feel happy. But taking God seriously, which is what I've been thinking about, when I've looked at these passages, means exactly that. It means if you want God in your life, if you open your life to God, then he sets the agenda. That's what it means. He makes the decisions. He has to be allowed to make a mess, whether you like it or not. He has to be allowed to disturb the things that you have in your life that you have put there purely to take his place, to meet the needs that he is supposed to meet. You have to let him do that if you want to take him seriously. I mentioned Eli, who we heard about. He died. I spoke about last week. I said I had a soft spot for Eli. I felt he was a good man. I feel like Eli is a character who takes God seriously. Last week we heard how when Hannah corrected him, he misunderstood Hannah. Hannah corrected him. He said, well, may the Lord of Israel grant you what you're praying for. Today, we hear about the fact that he actually dies because the Ark of the Lord is taken. But in chapter 3, which we didn't look at, a more familiar story, perhaps a passage that you may have expected me to read out and to speak on, is the story of Samuel as a child in the temple. And Eli is his mentor as the priest. And Samuel is asleep one day and he's woken up by someone calling his name, and he thinks it's Eli, so he goes to Eli and says, "What? You called me?" And Eli says, "No, I didn't. Go back to sleep." And it happens again, and Eli eventually figures out what's happening. He says, "Okay, Samuel, the next time you hear his voice, just say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" And it happens, and it is God speaking to Samuel, and God says to Samuel, "Samuel, I've got a message for you." And it's a message about Eli. And the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, are priests, but they're not good priests. We kind of haven't noticed this before. We didn't look at it last week, but I'm telling you, they're bad. They're bad men. They are abusing the privilege. They are corrupt. They are bringing disgrace on God's name. And Eli, as their father and as a priest, has not really done anything about it. I said last week, Eli's not perfect. This is one of the ways he's not perfect. He's kind of not really taken his sons into hand. And God says to Samuel, look, there's a consequence to this. Eli's line is going to be cut off. Eli's sons are going to die. This is the end. This is the consequences. Anyway, Samuel, who's just a child, has this message from God, and Eli says to him in the morning, "So what did God say to you?" And Samuel says, "Oh, nothing much. Nothing much. Don't worry about it, Eli." And Eli says, No, tell me. Tell me what God has said. And Samuel says, "Well, actually, Eli, it's a message for you. It's bad news. Your sons are going to die. Your line's going to be cut off because they have disgraced God's name as priests." And Eli, when he hears about this, Eli's response, chapter 3, verse 18, is this. He says, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." That's Eli's response to hearing that God is going to show up and it's going to be bad news for his family. Eli, for all his faults, as I said, has a good heart. Eli is a man who I think took God seriously. He understood this. God sets the agenda. God calls the shots, even when it hurts. In the story of Eli there, it reminds me of another moment in the future where a man kneels in a garden and says, "Lord, I don't want to do this, but not my will, but yours be done." Same prayer. He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. Now here's the thing. Taking God seriously. This is what we're talking about. Now it can be tempting to think that, what taking God seriously means is just being perfect. Just always doing the right thing, always responding to God, always getting it right. But taking God seriously does not mean being perfect. It does not mean never getting things wrong. Eli, I think, is an example of that. If you think that to take God seriously, you have to get it right every time, you have to never make a mistake, you have to be perfect, you have to be without sin, and anything less is not taking God seriously. Get rid of that idea right now. That idea will not help you. It will not make you a better person. It will not draw you closer to God. Taking God seriously just means that whenever God shows up in your life, whether he wants to disrupt and unsettle you or whether he wants to bless you, whether he wants to give you peace in a moment where you're feeling distressed, or whether he wants to confront you with your own sin, whether he wants to smash the idols in your life, or whether he wants to say, you know what, just rest, just enjoy my blessing for a while. Whatever he is doing, your response is the same. Whether it's blessing or discomfort, your response is, he is the Lord, let him do what is good in his eyes. That's what it means to take God seriously. Not perfection, but trust. Not never making a mistake, never getting things wrong, but being okay with owning your mistakes and letting God sort it out and saying, God, you know what you're doing. And that's enough for me. A few years ago I read a story about a teenager called Tom, a teenage boy. This was in America. He and his friends were just walking down the street one evening. It was dark, and a police car comes around the corner. And they're just sort of teenage boys out. They've not done anything wrong, but they're kind of gripped in that moment with, I don't know what it is. They just don't want to be seen by a police car. Maybe you know that. Maybe you know you're in the traffic and a police car pulls up behind you and you start to panic and sweat even though you've done nothing wrong. Maybe you talk to David Lavender or Simon and you sort of freak out a bit every time you talk to them. Maybe you know that. But they're just teenage boys like this. So when the police car comes around the corner, they duck down an alleyway. They sort of see the police car and duck down an alleyway. Now, what do you think the police do when they see this group of teenage boys just run down an alleyway? They're in the alleyway and they see the police car pull up and stop outside at the top of the alleyway. And they see the officers get out. And one of them has a torch, a flashlight, a searchlight, and is shining this powerful beam of light down the alley. And Tom is standing there, he looks around, he can't see his friends. He's standing there by himself. So he does the only thing he thinks he can do. He throws himself behind some rubbish bins in the alleyway. And he's crouched behind these rubbish bins, and his friends are there. His friends are already there, and they see this light coming down toward the alley towards them. And they're crouched behind these rubbish bins, and they're putting rubbish all over themselves to try and hide from these police officers. And this searchlight, this beam of torch shines right on Tom. And a voice says, come out where we can see you. And so Tom stands up. He's standing there covered in rubbish. And the policeman says, what were you doing? And Tom says, nothing. And the police officer says, I can't hear you. What were you doing? And all Tom can see is this blinding light. And he says, nothing. I wasn't doing anything. I saw the light and I ran. And I knocked over some bins. I'm sorry about the disturbance, officer. And then the police officer says, I think I recognise you. Don't you live round the corner? And Tom thinks his world has ended. Because either he's going to be arrested, or even worse, the police officer's going to talk to his parents. And so he's at the lowest he can be. He says, yes, I live round the corner. And then Tom said the police officer said something he wasn't expecting. He said, the police officer just said, son, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to protect you. We stand before God, bright light shining on us, up to our necks in rubbish. And God says, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to protect you. And how many of us can't bring ourselves to trust God? Because ultimately we believe that when he comes into our life, what he wants to do is punish us for the things we've done wrong. We hear a knock on our door, we look out the window, we see God standing there, and he's got a sledgehammer in his hands. And we think, I'm not answering the door. God wants to come in and punish me. God wants to come in and protect us. Protect us from all the things we put up, all those idols we build, to Dagon or whatever it is, that we think will protect us but will not. God wants to come in and protect us from them. He wants to smash them, break them up, put himself in the rightful place in our lives and protect us from the things that promise to protect us but can't. Replace all the rubbish in our lives with himself. That's what he wants to do. Ultimately, God wants us to experience the blessing that comes from living a life of trust and security in him. Hannah, in her prayer, understood, I think, that, you know what? Maybe it's time to put God's kingdom first. Maybe it's time to pray for that. And if that's that's the first step, in a sense, to taking God seriously. But once you get to that place where you realise that actually I want God's kingdom to come, then the next step is letting God do that. Being okay with him doing that. Realising that that's God's agenda too. So let him get on with it. And ultimately, God intends the best for his kingdom. And ultimately, that means he intends the best for us. And only, I think, when we understand and realise that God intends the best for us, that we come to that position of trust and we can pray the prayer of all those men and women who take God seriously. You are the Lord. Do what is good in your eyes.